I learned the hard way that sometimes the people you help the most are the ones who will stab you in the back when given the opportunity. And it all started on a Tuesday morning when Patricia Henderson marched into my auto shop like she owned the place and demanded I hand over my entire inventory of antifreeze for her personal use. My name is Kenneth Reyes, and I have been running Reyes Auto Service in Scottsdale, Arizona for the past 8 years. The business had been my father's before me, and when he passed away from a heart attack 3 years ago, I inherited both the shop and his reputation for honest work at fair prices. I specialized in fleet maintenance, which meant I had contracts with several local businesses and organizations to keep their vehicles running smoothly. One of my biggest accounts was the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association, a sprawling planned community of about 300 homes spread across 80 acres of what used to be desert scrubland before developers got their hands on it. The HOA contract was lucrative. They had a fleet of 6 vehicles including 2 maintenance trucks, a small bus they used for community events, 2 golf carts for the security patrol, and a utility vehicle the landscaping crew drove around. Every month I serviced those vehicles, changed their oil, rotated tires, replaced brake pads, and handled whatever else needed attention. The board paid on time, and until Patricia Henderson became the HOA president 9 months ago, everything ran smoothly. Patricia was exactly what you would picture when someone says the name. A 52-year-old woman with an asymmetrical blonde bob that probably cost more than most people's car payments. Designer athleisure, where that she lived in despite never actually exercising, and an expression that suggested she perpetually smelled something unpleasant. She had moved to Sunset Ridge about 2 years ago after her divorce from some corporate executive, and apparently decided that running an HOA with an iron fist would fill the void in her life. That Tuesday morning, I was under a Honda Accord replacing the transmission fluid when I heard the door chime. I rolled out on my creeper to see Patricia standing in the customer waiting area, her arms crossed and her foot tapping impatiently on the concrete floor. "Kenneth," she said, not even bothering with a greeting, "I need all your antifreeze right now." I stood up, wiping my hands on a shop rag. "I am sorry, what? Your antifreeze supply, I need it. We are having issues with the heating systems in several homes in the community, and the plumber said we need antifreeze for the radiant floor heating. I need at least 20 gallons. I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what she had just said. "Patricia, I use that antifreeze for vehicles, for the fleet I maintain, including your HOA vehicles. I cannot just give you my inventory." Her eyes narrowed. "The HOA is your client, Kenneth. We pay you good money every month for your services. The least you can do is help us out when we need something." "I do help you out. I maintain your vehicles, which is what we have a contract for. But my antifreeze supply is not part of that contract. Plus, you need a specific type of antifreeze for radiant heating systems. What I have here is ethylene glycol-based coolant for automotive use. It is not the same thing." "Antifreeze is antifreeze," Patricia said dismissively. "Stop trying to complicate things. I need 20 gallons and I need it now." I took a deep breath, trying to remain professional. Even if it was the right type, which it is not, I have other clients who depend on me having supplies in stock. I have got 3 fleet vehicles coming in tomorrow that need coolant flushes. I cannot give you my inventory." Patricia stepped closer, and I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with what was probably her 3rd latte of the morning. "Let me make this very clear, Kenneth. The HOA board met last night, and we decided that since we are such a valuable client, you should be providing us with preferential treatment. That includes access to your supplies when we need them." That is not how any of this works, I said, feeling my patience starting to wear thin. You cannot just decide you are entitled to my inventory because you pay me to work on your vehicles. Those are two completely separate things. Fine, Patricia said, her voice dropping to a dangerous level. Then maybe we need to reconsider our contract with you. There are plenty of other mechanics in Scottsdale who would love to have our business and would be much more accommodating. There it was, the threat I had been waiting for. Patricia had pulled this move before with other vendors in the community. She had gotten the landscaping company to give the HOA a 30% discount by threatening to take the contract elsewhere. She had bullied the pool maintenance service into working weekends at no extra charge. And now she was trying the same tactic with me. The problem was, I did not respond well to threats. You know what, Patricia? Maybe you should find another mechanic, because I am not giving you my antifreeze and I am not going to let you bully me into doing something that makes no business sense. Her face turned red and for a moment I thought she might actually explode. You are making a huge mistake, Kenneth. The HOA board will hear about this. I am sure they will, I said calmly. Now if you will excuse me, I have actual work to do. Patricia turned on her heel and stormed out of my shop, the door slamming behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I had just made a massive mistake. The HOA contract was worth about $4,000 a month, which was not nothing. But I had built my business on integrity and fair dealing, and I was not about to let someone like Patricia Henderson push me around. I went back to work on the Honda, figuring that would be the end of it. Patricia would complain to the board. They would probably side with her because that is what boards do, and I would lose the contract. It would hurt financially, but I would survive. I had other clients, other contracts, and a good enough reputation that word of mouth would keep bringing in new business. I was wrong about it being the end of it. It was just the beginning. 2 days later, on Thursday afternoon, I received a certified letter from the Sunset Ridge HOA. Inside was a formal notice informing me that my services were no longer required, effective immediately, and that I was to return all HOA property in my possession within 48 hours. There was also a demand for a full refund of the previous month's service fees, claiming that I had provided substandard work and failed to meet contractual obligations. I read the letter 3 times, my anger building with each pass. The substandard work claim was complete garbage. I had meticulous records of every service I had performed on those vehicles, including photographs and detailed notes. The vehicles were in better condition now than when I had started servicing them, and the contractual obligations I had supposedly failed to meet. There was nothing in our contract that said I had to provide them with automotive supplies for non-automotive purposes. This was retaliation, pure and simple. Patricia was punishing me for not giving her what she wanted, and she was using her position as HOA president to do it. I called my attorney, a sharp woman named Margaret Chen who had helped me set up my business and handled my contracts. She read through the letter and the original service agreement, then let out a low whistle. "They do not have a leg to stand on," Margaret said. "Your contract specifies vehicle maintenance services, nothing about providing supplies for other purposes, and they would need to prove substandard work, which I am guessing they cannot do." "They definitely cannot," I said. "I have documentation of everything." "Good. Here is what we are going to do. You are going to write a formal response denying their claims and refusing the refund demand. You are also going to invoice them for the work you did this month before they terminated the contract. Then we sit back and see what they do." "What if they sue?" Margaret laughed. "Let them try. They would lose and they would end up paying your legal fees on top of it, but I do not think it will come to that. This is just a power play. They are trying to bully you into backing down. I took Margaret's advice and sent the formal response. I also made copies of all my service records and photographs, just in case I needed them later. Then I waited to see what the HOA would do next. What they did next was worse than I expected. The following Monday, I got a call from the Arizona Registrar of Contractors, informing me that a complaint had been filed against my business license. Someone had claimed that I was operating without proper insurance, that I had damaged property while performing services, and that I had refused to correct the damage. The claims were all false, and I was able to provide documentation proving it, but dealing with the complaint took up half my day and a significant amount of stress. Then on Wednesday, the health department showed up at my shop wanting to inspect for hazardous waste violations. Again, I was fully compliant with all regulations, but the inspection took hours and disrupted my work schedule. I knew exactly who was behind this. Patricia Henderson was using her connections and influence to make my life as difficult as possible. She was filing false complaints and pulling strings to get various regulatory agencies to investigate me. It was harassment, plain and simple, but it was also hard to prove. The breaking point came 2 weeks after I had refused to give Patricia the antifreeze. I was closing up the shop on a Friday evening when 2 Scottsdale police officers pulled into the parking lot. My heart sank as they got out of their cruiser and walked toward me. "Kenneth Reyes," one of them asked. "That is me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We have received a report that you are in possession of stolen property, specifically tools and equipment belonging to the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association." I stared at them in disbelief. "That is completely false. I returned all HOA property weeks ago. You have proof of that." I have the signed receipt from their maintenance supervisor acknowledging that I returned everything. The officers looked at each other, and I could see they were not entirely convinced by whatever story Patricia had fed them. "Can we see that receipt?" I went inside and pulled up the digital copy on my computer, then printed it out for them. The receipt clearly showed that Carlos Mendoza, the HOA maintenance supervisor, had received and inspected all returned property and signed off that everything was accounted for. The older of the 2 officers studied the receipt, then handed it back to me. "This seems pretty clear. Do you know why someone would file a false report?" "I have a theory," I said, and proceeded to explain the entire situation with Patricia Henderson, the antifreeze demand, the contract termination, and all the harassment that had followed. The officers listened, taking notes, and when I finished, the younger one shook his head. "HOA disputes. We get these calls all the time. Usually it is about someone painting their house the wrong shade of beige or parking an RV in their driveway. This is definitely the most creative one I have heard in a while," the older officer said. "Look, Mr. Reyes, we are going to note in our report that you provided documentation proving the property was returned. If this person keeps filing false reports, she could be charged with making false statements to law enforcement. You might want to consider getting a restraining order if the harassment continues." After the officers left, I sat in my office for a long time, trying to decide what to do. The harassment was affecting my business, my mental health, and my reputation. I had done nothing wrong except refuse an unreasonable demand, and now I was being punished for it. That is when I remembered something important, something that could change everything. The HOA had terminated my services, which meant I was no longer under any obligation to them. But they still had 6 vehicles that required regular maintenance. Vehicles that I had been keeping in excellent condition for the past 2 years. Vehicles that, without proper maintenance, would start having problems very quickly. And Arizona in late spring gets hot. Really hot. Hot enough that vehicles without proper coolant will overheat and suffer catastrophic engine damage. I was not going to sabotage anything. That would be illegal and unethical. But I was also not going to warn them about the maintenance schedules I had been following, the specific issues each vehicle had, or the fact that 3 of their vehicles were due for coolant flushes within the next 2 weeks. Sometimes the best revenge is simply stepping back and letting natural consequences take their course. I spent the weekend relaxing for the first time in weeks, trying not to think about the HOA or Patricia Henderson. I went hiking in the McDowell Sonoran Preserve, had dinner with some friends, and generally tried to decompress from the stress of the previous month. Monday morning, I was in the shop working on a brake job when my phone rang. It was Carlos Mendoza, the HOA maintenance supervisor. Carlos was a good guy, a hard-working man in his mid-40s who had always been professional and friendly during our dealings. "Kenneth, man, I am sorry to bother you," Carlos said, and I could hear the stress in his voice. "But we have got a problem. The maintenance truck just overheated and died on me in the middle of the community. I am stuck here with a full load of landscaping equipment and no way to move it." "That is unfortunate," I said carefully. "Have you called your new mechanic?" "That is the thing. We do not have one yet. Patricia said she was handling it, but I guess she has not gotten around to it. Look, I know there was some kind of dispute between you and the board, but this is an emergency. Can you help us out?" I felt a twinge of sympathy for Carlos. He was just trying to do his job, and he was getting caught in the crossfire of Patricia's vendetta against me. But I also knew that if I helped them now, I would just be opening myself up to more problems. "Carlos, I would love to help, but the HOA terminated my contract and then filed false complaints against me with multiple agencies. They even had the police show up at my shop accusing me of theft. I cannot work for them anymore." "Jesus, I did not know about all that." "Patricia just told us you were not meeting your obligations and she found someone better." "Yeah, well, that is not exactly how it went down. I am sorry, Carlos, but you are going to need to find another mechanic. Try Desert Auto Works on Shea Boulevard. They do good work." Carlos sighed. "All right, man, I understand, and for what it is worth, I am sorry about all this. Patricia has been making everyone's life difficult lately." After I hung up, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and guilt. Satisfaction that my prediction about the vehicles having problems was coming true, and guilt that Carlos was the one dealing with the consequences. But I reminded myself that this was not my problem anymore. The HOA had made their choice. Over the next week, I heard through the grapevine that the HOA was having multiple vehicle issues. The maintenance truck had needed a new water pump and radiator hoses, costing them over $1,500 in parts and labor. One of the golf carts had battery issues and died halfway through a security patrol. The community bus broke down while transporting residents to a planned outing, leaving 20 elderly homeowners stranded at a shopping center for 2 hours while they waited for a tow truck. Each incident made Patricia look worse in the eyes of the community. Residents were starting to ask questions about why the vehicles were suddenly falling apart and why the HOA had fired their reliable mechanic. Patricia, naturally, blamed me, telling anyone who would listen that I had sabotaged the vehicles before returning them. That accusation was a mistake on her part. I had documentation proving that all vehicles had been in excellent condition when I returned them. I had photographs, service records, and even video footage from the security cameras in my shop showing the condition of each vehicle. When word got back to me that Patricia was accusing me of sabotage, I called Margaret Chen again. "That is defamation," Margaret said immediately. "She is making false statements that are damaging your professional reputation. We can sue her personally and the HOA for defamation and business interference." "Will that actually go anywhere?" "Oh, absolutely. Especially since you have documentation proving the vehicles were in good condition. Her accusations are demonstrably false, and she is making them in a way that is damaging your business. I would be happy to send her a cease and desist letter." "Do it," I said. "I am done playing nice." Margaret drafted a strongly worded cease and desist letter outlining all of Patricia's actions, from the initial antifreeze demand to the false complaints to the defamation. The letter demanded that Patricia immediately stop making false statements about me and my business, and warned that continued harassment would result in legal action. The letter was delivered to Patricia's home via a process server on a Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday morning, I received a call from an attorney representing the HOA board. His name was David Strickland, and unlike Patricia, he sounded reasonable and professional. "Mr. Reyes, I am calling on behalf of the Sunset Ridge HOA board. I have been reviewing the situation between you and Mrs. Henderson, and I have some concerns about how things have been handled." "That is an understatement," I said. "I agree. I have advised the board that Mrs. Henderson's actions may have exposed the HOA to significant legal liability. They are taking this very seriously. I would like to propose a meeting to discuss a resolution." "What kind of resolution?" "Ideally, one where we can settle this matter without litigation. The board is prepared to issue a formal apology, pay any damages you have incurred as a result of Mrs. Henderson's actions, and potentially reinstate your service contract if you are interested." I thought about it for a moment. On one hand, having the contract back would be good for business. On the other hand, I did not want to deal with Patricia Henderson anymore. "I am willing to meet," I said finally. "But I want it clear that any resolution has to include assurances that Patricia Henderson will have no involvement in any future dealings with my business." "Understood. I will coordinate with your attorney to set up a meeting." The meeting took place the following Tuesday at the HOA Community Center. Present were David Strickland, 3 members of the HOA board including Vice President Thomas Mitchell, Treasurer Sandra Yates, and Secretary George Hamilton. Patricia Henderson was notably absent. Also present were Margaret Chen and myself. David Strickland started the meeting by outlining the situation from the board's perspective. Apparently, Patricia had not told the full board about her demand for my antifreeze or the circumstances surrounding the contract termination. She had simply told them that I was not meeting my obligations and that she was handling it. The false complaints to various agencies had been filed without the board's knowledge, and the defamation had been Patricia acting on her own. The board wants to make clear that Mrs. Henderson's actions do not represent the HOA's position or values, Thomas Mitchell said. He was a retired accountant in his late 60s with kind eyes and a calming demeanor. "We pride ourselves on maintaining good relationships with our vendors and service providers. What happened here is completely unacceptable." "So where is Patricia?" I asked. "Why is she not here to apologize herself?" The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sandra Yates, a sharp-looking woman in her 50s, spoke up. "Mrs. Henderson has been removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. The board held an emergency vote last night after reviewing all the evidence. She has also been removed from all committee positions. That was unexpected. I had not thought they would actually remove her from the board entirely. We are also considering legal action against Mrs. Henderson, personally, for exceeding her authority and exposing the HOA to liability," George Hamilton added. He was younger than the others, maybe early 40s, and had an intensity about him that suggested he took HOA governance very seriously. Margaret leaned forward. "What about the damages my client has incurred?" "He has lost income from the terminated contract, spent time and money responding to false complaints, and suffered damage to his professional reputation." David Strickland nodded. "The board is prepared to offer compensation. We would like to reinstate the service contract retroactively, paying Mr. Reyes for the months he was unable to work due to the wrongful termination. We are also prepared to pay $15,000 in additional damages to cover his time, legal fees, and reputational harm. In exchange, Mr. Reyes would agree not to pursue further legal action against the HOA." Margaret and I stepped out of the room to confer. $15,000 plus back pay is not a bad offer," she said. "It is probably more than you would get if we went to court, and you would avoid the hassle of litigation." "What about Patricia?" I asked. "Does she just walk away from this? The board removing her is significant. And if you want to pursue action against her personally, nothing in this settlement would prevent that. The HOA is covering their own liability, not hers." I thought about it. The money was good, and getting the contract back would be beneficial for my business. More importantly, Patricia had already faced consequences for her actions. She had lost her position and her power, which was probably more painful to her than any financial settlement would be. "All right," I said. "Let them know we accept, but I wanted in writing that Patricia Henderson is to have no involvement in any decisions or interactions regarding my service contract." We went back into the meeting and hammered out the final details. The settlement agreement was drawn up and signed that afternoon. I walked out of there with a check for $18,000, representing the back pay and damages, and a renewed contract that was actually more favorable than the previous one. The board had added provisions for emergency services and increased the monthly retainer to $4,500. I thought that would be the end of it, but Patricia Henderson was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. About a week after the settlement, I started receiving strange calls at my shop. The calls would come at odd hours, sometimes late at night when the shop was closed. When I answered, there would be silence on the other end, then the line would disconnect. My business email started getting spam bombed with thousands of junk messages. Someone left a negative review on my Google business page claiming I had damaged their car and refused to fix it, even though the reviewer had never been a customer. It was petty harassment, but it was effective in being annoying. I reported the phone calls to the police, who said there was not much they could do without proof of who was making them. I cleaned up the email spam and responded to the fake review explaining that the person had never been a customer and providing evidence of my positive track record. Then things escalated. One morning I arrived at my shop to find that someone had spray painted the word thief across the front window in large red letters. The security cameras I had installed after the initial problems with Patricia had been spray painted over as well, so there was no footage of who had done it. I called the police, and the same two officers who had responded to Patricia's false theft report showed up to take a statement. "This is getting out of hand," the older officer said, surveying the damage. "You said you had issues with that HOA president before." "Former HOA president," I corrected. "Yeah, Patricia Henderson, but I cannot prove she is behind this. Maybe not directly, but there is a pattern of harassment here. File a formal complaint and we will document everything. If it continues, we will have grounds to investigate further." I filed the complaint and spent the rest of the day cleaning the paint off my window and replacing the security cameras. The vandalism had cost me time and money, but more than that, it was exhausting. I just wanted to run my business in peace. 2 nights later, my phone rang at 2 in the morning. I almost did not answer, figuring it was another one of the silent harassment calls, but something made me pick up. "Kenneth Reyes," a male voice asked. "Who is this?" "My name is Frank Henderson. I am Patricia's ex-husband. I think we need to talk." I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "About what?" "About my ex-wife's behavior and what you can do to protect yourself. Can we meet somewhere tomorrow? Somewhere public?" We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Old Town Scottsdale the next morning. Frank Henderson turned out to be a tired-looking man in his late 50s with gray hair and expensive but rumpled clothes. He ordered a black coffee and got straight to the point. "I heard through mutual friends about what Patricia has been doing to you. I wanted to reach out because I have been through something similar with her, and I know how destructive she can be." "I am listening," I said. "Patricia has a pattern of behavior. When she does not get what she wants, she becomes obsessed with punishing whoever denied her. It happened during our divorce. I would not agree to her unreasonable settlement demands, so she spent 2 years making my life hell. False accusations, harassment, turning our friends against me. It cost me over $100,000 in legal fees before it was finally over." "So what did you do?" "I documented everything. Every interaction, every incident, every time she violated the restraining order I eventually had to get. And I built such an overwhelming case that her own attorney advised her to back off or face serious legal consequences." Frank pulled out a thick folder and slid it across the table. "These are copies of documents from my divorce proceedings. They show Patricia's pattern of harassment and retaliation. Your attorney might find them useful if you end up pursuing legal action against her." I opened the folder and flipped through the contents. There were police reports, emails, text messages, even testimony from a psychologist who had evaluated Patricia during the divorce proceedings and noted her narcissistic tendencies and vindictive behavior. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. "Because Patricia needs to face consequences for once in her life. She has been getting away with this behavior for years because most people eventually give up and move on. But if enough people stand up to her and document her actions, eventually the system will hold her accountable." I took the folder and thanked Frank for his time. After he left, I sat in the coffee shop for a while, reading through the documents. It was like looking at a blueprint for everything Patricia had done to me, except on a much larger scale. The harassment, the false accusations, the attempts to destroy someone's reputation. It was all there, documented in painful detail. I took the folder to Margaret Chen that afternoon. She spent an hour reviewing the contents, her expression growing more serious as she read. "This is really damning," she said finally. "It establishes a clear pattern of behavior. Combined with what she has done to you, we have a strong case for a restraining order at minimum, possibly a civil lawsuit for harassment and emotional distress. What about criminal charges?" "That is harder. Most of what she has done falls into a gray area. The false complaints to agencies, the defamation, the harassment calls, they are all civil matters unless we can prove something more serious. The vandalism, if we could prove she did it or ordered it done, could be criminal mischief. But without evidence directly tying her to it, it is tough. So what do? We file for a restraining order and we keep documenting everything. Every incident, every call, every piece of harassment. We build an overwhelming case, and eventually Patricia will either back off, or she will cross a line that gives us grounds for more serious action." We filed for the restraining order the next day. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, which meant I had to endure 2 more weeks of Patricia's harassment. But knowing that I had a legal remedy in progress made it slightly more bearable. During those 2 weeks, the harassment continued but took on a new form. Someone filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau claiming I had defrauded them. Someone else left a 1-star review on Yelp with similar false claims. My business insurance company received an anonymous tip that I was operating without proper coverage, which triggered an audit. Each incident was documented. Each incident added to the pile of evidence against Patricia. The day of the restraining order hearing arrived, and I showed up at the courthouse with Margaret and a thick binder full of documentation. Patricia was there with her own attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who probably specialized in helping difficult people avoid consequences. The hearing was in front of Judge Rachel Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s who had a reputation for cutting through nonsense and getting to the truth. We presented our case, walking through the timeline of events from the initial antifreeze demand to the most recent harassment incidents. Margaret introduced Frank Henderson's documents as evidence of Patricia's pattern of behavior. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that there was no proof Patricia was behind any of the harassment, that it could be anyone, and that I was engaging in a vendetta against his client because of the contract dispute. Judge Morrison was not buying it. "Counselor, you are asking me to believe that Mr. Reyes is experiencing a sustained campaign of harassment that just happens to have started immediately after a dispute with your client, who has a documented history of similar behavior toward her ex-husband. That is quite a coincidence." Your Honor, past behavior in a divorce proceeding is not evidence of current wrongdoing. No, but it is evidence of a pattern of behavior that makes the current allegations more credible. Mr. Reyes has documented every incident and shown that they all started after he refused your client's demand for automotive supplies and subsequently had his contract terminated. The timing is too consistent to be coincidental. The judge reviewed all the evidence, asked both sides some clarifying questions, and then made her ruling. I am granting the restraining order. Mrs. Henderson, you are prohibited from contacting Mr. Reyes directly or indirectly, from coming within 500 feet of his place of business, and from making any further false reports or statements about him or his business. Violation of this order will result in criminal contempt charges. Do you understand? Patricia's face had gone pale, but she nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Good. I am also referring this matter to the Scottsdale City Attorney's Office for review. Some of the allegations in Mr. Reyes's filing, particularly regarding false reports to law enforcement and regulatory agencies, may constitute criminal offenses. That will be their decision to pursue. That last part caught me by surprise. I had not expected the judge to refer anything for criminal prosecution. Margaret smiled slightly and made a note on her legal pad. After the hearing, Patricia and her attorney left quickly without saying anything. Margaret and I stood outside the courthouse, and I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. What happens now? I asked. Now we wait and see if Patricia violates the restraining order. My guess is she will not. She is probably terrified right now that the city attorney might actually file charges, but keep documenting everything, just in case. The next few weeks were blissfully quiet. No harassment calls, no fake reviews, no vandalism. I got back to focusing on my business, and the HOA vehicles were running smoothly again. Carlos Mendoza told me that the residents were much happier with the service since I had returned, and several homeowners had even thanked him for getting me back. Then I got a call from an investigator with the Scottsdale City Attorney's Office. Her name was Detective Lisa Warner, and she wanted to interview me about Patricia Henderson. We met at a neutral location, a conference room at the city offices. Detective Warner was a professional woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that suggested she did not miss much. "Mr. Reyes, thank you for meeting with me. I have been reviewing the materials from your restraining order hearing, and I have some questions, specifically about the false reports Mrs. Henderson filed with various agencies." "I will help however I can," I said. "Good. Because filing false reports with law enforcement and regulatory agencies is a crime. It wastes government resources, and in your case, it was done with the intent to harm your business and reputation. That is serious." Over the next 2 hours, I walked Detective Warner through everything that had happened. She took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about specific incidents. She was particularly interested in the false police report about stolen property and the false complaints to the registrar of contractors. "Those are the ones we can prove most easily," she explained. "You have documentation showing that the property was returned and that you were in compliance with all regulations. Her complaints were objectively false, and we can show that she knew they were false when she filed them. So, what happens now?" "I am going to recommend to the city attorney that we file charges. Likely several counts of making false statements to law enforcement, plus counts for each false regulatory complaint. If convicted, Mrs. Henderson could face fines and possibly even jail time." "Jail time seems extreme," I said, surprising myself. Despite everything Patricia had put me through, the idea of her actually going to jail felt wrong. Detective Warner gave me a sympathetic look. "I understand your hesitation, but people like Mrs. Henderson need to face real consequences, or they will keep doing this to others. Your case is not the first time she has filed false complaints. We found 2 other instances in our system where she filed reports against neighbors that turned out to be unfounded." That information changed my perspective. Patricia was not just someone who had made bad decisions in a conflict with me. She was a repeat offender who had established a pattern of using false complaints as a weapon. "Then I will cooperate fully with your investigation," I said. The criminal case against Patricia Henderson moved forward slowly, as legal cases tend to do. She was formally charged with 3 counts of making false statements to law enforcement and 4 counts of filing false complaints with regulatory agencies. Each charge was a misdemeanor, but combined they added up to potentially serious penalties. Patricia pleaded not guilty and hired an expensive criminal defense attorney. The case was scheduled for trial, which meant I would have to testify. Margaret helped me prepare, walking me through what to expect and how to present my testimony clearly and credibly. Before the trial could begin, though, something unexpected happened. The Sunset Ridge HOA board filed a lawsuit against Patricia Henderson for breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of HOA funds, and exceeding her authority as president. Apparently, an audit had revealed that Patricia had been using HOA money to pay for her personal legal expenses and had spent over $10,000 from the HOA budget without board approval. The civil lawsuit gave the prosecutors additional leverage, and Patricia's attorneys reached out to discuss a plea agreement. After some negotiation, Patricia agreed to plead guilty to 2 counts of making false statements and 1 count of filing a false regulatory complaint. In exchange, the other charges would be dismissed, and she would receive a sentence of probation, community service, fines, and an order to pay restitution to me for my legal expenses and lost business. The plea hearing took place on a Thursday morning in August. The courtroom was hot despite the air conditioning, and Patricia looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her poor choices. She stood before the judge and admitted her guilt in a quiet voice. Judge Morrison, the same judge who had granted my restraining order, sentenced Patricia to 2 years of supervised probation, 300 hours of community service, a fine of $5,000, and ordered her to pay me $22,000 in restitution. The judge also ordered Patricia to continue mental health counseling as a condition of her probation. Mrs. Henderson, you used your position and influence to wage a personal vendetta against someone who did nothing more than refuse an unreasonable demand, Judge Morrison said. Your actions wasted law enforcement and regulatory resources, damaged an innocent person's business and reputation, and showed a disturbing pattern of vindictive behavior. You are fortunate that the prosecution agreed to this plea, because a trial conviction on all charges could have resulted in jail time. I strongly suggest you use your probation period to reflect on your behavior and make better choices going forward. Patricia nodded, tears running down her face. Yes, Your Honor, I am sorry for what I did. After the hearing, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that it was finally over, satisfaction that Patricia had faced consequences, but also a strange emptiness. I had spent months of my life dealing with this situation, and now it was done. Just like that, Margaret walked with me out of the courthouse. How are you feeling? Honestly, exhausted, but also glad it is over. You did the right thing standing up to her. A lot of people would have just backed down and let her get away with it. Yeah, well, I am stubborn that way. The restitution money came through about 6 weeks later. Combined with the settlement from the HOA, I had more than recovered my financial losses. But more importantly, I had proven that bullies do not always win, even when they have power and position. The Sunset Ridge HOA continued to be one of my best clients. Thomas Mitchell took over as president, and he ran the board with fairness and professionalism. The community's vehicles ran smoothly, and I never had another problem with unreasonable demands or harassment. I heard through the grapevine that Patricia had moved out of Sunset Ridge about 6 months after her sentencing. Apparently, the other residents had made it clear that she was not welcome, and the social isolation had become too much for her. She sold her house and moved to a different part of Phoenix, somewhere she could start over without everyone knowing about her criminal record and her fall from power. I never saw Patricia Henderson again after that day in court, and I was fine with that. Some people drift in and out of your life, leaving their mark and then moving on. Patricia had definitely left her mark, though probably not in the way she had intended. About a year after everything had settled, I was working in my shop on a particularly hot afternoon when Carlos Mendoza stopped by to drop off one of the HOA maintenance trucks for service. We chatted while I ran the diagnostic check, and he mentioned that the community was planning a big celebration for their 15th anniversary. You should come, Carlos said. You are part of the community in a way. You keep our vehicles running, and after all that drama with Patricia, people respect what you went through. I am not really a party person, I said. Come on, man. Free food, cold beer, and a chance to socialize. Plus, I think some folks would like to thank you properly for not holding grudges after everything that happened. I agreed to stop by, more to be polite than out of any real desire to attend an HOA party. But when I showed up that Saturday evening, I was surprised by how welcoming everyone was. People I had never met came up to shake my hand and thank me for continuing to service the community vehicles. Thomas Mitchell gave a short speech mentioning the importance of good vendor relationships and professional integrity. It was nice, in a way, to see that good things could come from standing your ground and doing what was right, even when it was difficult. I stayed at the party longer than I had planned, enjoying the food and conversation. As the sun set over the McDowell Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized that this whole experience had taught me something valuable. It had taught me that integrity matters, that documentation saves lives, and that sometimes you have to fight back against bullies even when it would be easier to just give in. It had also taught me that antifreeze is just antifreeze, but principles are worth fighting for. The years that followed were good ones for my business. Word spread about how I had stood up to an abusive HOA president and won, and it actually brought me more clients. People appreciated working with someone who had integrity and would not be pushed around. My business grew. I hired 2 more mechanics, and eventually I opened a second location in North Scottsdale. I never forgot the lessons I learned from dealing with Patricia Henderson. I kept meticulous records of everything. I stood firm on reasonable boundaries, and I never let anyone bully me into doing something that went against my principles or business practices. And I never, ever gave away my antifreeze supply to someone who wanted to use it for radiant floor heating. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Patricia, whether she learned anything from her experience, or whether she just found new people to torment in her new neighborhood. But mostly, I do not think about her at all. She was a chapter in my life that closed, and I was content to leave it that way. The Sunset Ridge HOA remained one of my favorite clients. Thomas Mitchell served as president for several more years before passing the torch to Sandra Yates, who was equally professional and fair. The vehicles continued to run smoothly, the residents were happy, and my monthly service visits became routine in the best possible way. I did make one small change to my service contracts after the Patricia Henderson incident. I added a clause specifically stating that the provision of parts and supplies was limited to the vehicles being serviced under the contract, and that any requests for materials for other purposes would be considered separate transactions subject to availability and appropriate pricing. Margaret Chen thought it was unnecessary, but I figured it could not hurt to be explicit. You know that clause would not have stopped Patricia from making her demand, right? Margaret had said when I showed her the updated contract. No, but it would have given me clearer grounds to refuse from the start. Sometimes it is about having the documentation to back up your position. You have learned well, my friend. Life moved on as it always does. The automotive business continued to evolve with new technologies and changing customer needs. I adapted and grew with it, always maintaining my commitment to honest work at fair prices. The incident with Patricia Henderson became a story I occasionally told to illustrate the importance of standing your ground, but it no longer dominated my thoughts or affected my daily life. I did stay in touch with Frank Henderson, Patricia's ex-husband. We would get coffee every few months and talk about business, life, and the strange ways fate connects people. He told me that Patricia had remarried and moved to California, and that he had heard she was actually trying to get help for her issues. I hoped that was true, though I remained skeptical that people like Patricia could really change. The thing is, Frank said during one of our coffee meetings, I do not hate her. I am angry about what she put me through, and I am glad she faced consequences for what she did to you. But I also remember that she was not always like this. Something broke inside her along the way, and she became someone I did not recognize. Do you think people can change? I asked. I think people can change if they want to and if they put in the work. But they have to hit rock bottom first, and they have to actually want to be different. A lot of people would rather blame everyone else than look in the mirror. It was a sobering thought, and it made me realize that my experience with Patricia, as difficult as it had been, was probably just a small part of a much larger and sadder story. But that did not excuse her behavior or mean I regretted standing up to her. Sometimes doing the right thing means holding people accountable, even when their story is complicated. As I write this now, 5 years after that Tuesday morning when Patricia Henderson walked into my shop and demanded my antifreeze supply, I can see how that moment changed the trajectory of my life and business. It forced me to stand up for myself in a way I had never had to before. It taught me the value of documentation and legal protection. It showed me that good people will support you when you do the right thing, and that bullies eventually face consequences if you are willing to stand firm. My business is thriving. I have great relationships with my clients, and I sleep well at night knowing that I operate with integrity. The Sunset Ridge HOA vehicles are still running smoothly, maintained with the same care and attention I have always provided. Carlos Mendoza retired last year and was replaced by a younger guy named Miguel who is just as professional and easy to work with. I never did get around to installing radiant floor heating in my own home, though I have thought about it. If I do, I will make sure to use the proper propylene glycol-based antifreeze designed for the purpose, not automotive coolant, because even though it seems like a small distinction, details matter. Doing things the right way matters. And standing up for what is right matters, even when it is difficult, and even when it costs you something in the short term. That is the real lesson I learned from Patricia Henderson and her demand for my antifreeze supply. Not that HOA boards can be difficult, or that people in positions of power sometimes abuse that power. I already knew those things. The real lesson was that integrity is not just about doing the right thing when it is easy. It is about doing the right thing when it is hard, when it costs you something, when people with power are threatening you, and when giving in would be so much simpler. I chose not to give in, and that choice made all the difference. The morning sun streams through the windows of my expanded shop as I finish up some paperwork before the day's appointments begin. In a few hours, one of the Sunset Ridge maintenance trucks will arrive for its regular service. I will change the oil, check the antifreeze levels, inspect the brakes, and make sure everything is running smoothly. It is routine work, the kind of steady, honest labor that has sustained my business for years. And if anyone ever asks me for my antifreeze supply for non-automotive purposes, I will politely decline, refer them to the appropriate supplier, and document the interaction. Because some lessons, once learned, stay with you forever. That is my story about the HOA that demanded my antifreeze supply, and how I maintained their fleet vehicles and then stopped all service. It is a story about standing up to bullies, about the importance of documentation and legal protection, and about how doing the right thing eventually pays off, even when it seems like the harder path. And it is a story about antifreeze, which is a small thing that became the catalyst for something much larger. Sometimes the biggest battles in life start over the smallest things, and how you respond to those challenges defines who you are and what you stand for. I stood my ground, I fought back when necessary, and I came out the other side stronger and more successful. Patricia Henderson faced consequences for her actions. The legal system worked the way it was supposed to, and justice was served. Not every story has a clear, happy ending, but this one comes pretty close. My business is successful, my reputation is intact. The HOA learned valuable lessons about vendor relationships and accountability, and Patricia Henderson got the consequences and hopefully the help she needed. As for me, I go to work each day. I maintain vehicles with care and expertise, and I never forget that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to back down when someone with power makes an unreasonable demand. That refusal, that simple word no, can change everything. And that is worth more than all the antifreeze in Arizona.